Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final webinar in a series that we've been doing on Start with Equity from the early years to the early grades. My name is Linda Smith, and I'm the director of the Early Childhood Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, D.C. If you don't know us, we are a Washington, D.C. based think tank that tries to take the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to create policies that address the most pressing needs of our country. So with that in mind, there's nothing, I think, more pressing than the one before us today, and that is the issue of equity in the earliest years with our small children. So in the past, we've had 3 different webinars already. The first one that looked at the issues around the overall report and the challenges and opportunities there. The next one, we looked in depth at harsh discipline and its impact on our youngest children. Then we looked at children with disabilities and what were the challenges and opportunities there. So each of those, just for those of you who may have missed one of them, those are all online at both the BPC website and the ASU website. So if you haven't seen them, you still have an opportunity. I encourage you to do that. When it comes to the report, I just want to acknowledge all of the people, the many people who contributed to this report. If you haven't looked at it and read it, I would really invite you to do that. It's probably, I think, one of the best sources, if you will, of information, data, and research on this issue in the earliest years. I want to thank the over 70 national, state, local, and tribal experts from across the country who contributed to the report, to the Heising-Simons Foundation for their generous support of this work, then to the ASU and the BPC staff who worked behind the scenes for the last year to put this together with all of us and with the experts who provided information. So now I want to turn it over to Chantel Meek, who is the director of the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University and the primary author and driver behind this. We look forward to a robust discussion at the end of it. Just so you know, these slides will be posted. We always get that question immediately. We will post the slides along with the report, and if we will be taking questions in the chat. So if you have a question, please enter them in the chat. If we don't get to all of the questions by the end of this, we are keeping those questions and we'll be posting answers to your questions later on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chantel Meek. Thanks, Chantel.
We're excited to be partnering with Bipartisan Policy Center and your team on what are a critical set of issues around equity in learning settings. Today, we're here to talk about the almost 24 million kids in the US who speak a language other than English at home. Our beautiful, brilliant bilingual babies, 2 of whom live in my home. We're here to talk about what we know are their strengths. I know firsthand I was one of these kids, and my 2 kids today are 2 of those kids. And all of the kids in my family, and there are many, are the kids who we're going to be talking about today. We're here to talk about how, despite all of these great strengths, our systems, our instruction, our schools, our early childhood programs, our policies, our society broadly, starting at the top, continue to put barriers in their way, making them work twice as hard to reach their full potential. We're here to tell you about all that we found in our data and our research deep dives, and how it's not at all aligned with wide-scale policy and practice. We're going to focus on access to dual language and bilingual learning opportunities for our dual language learners, because we think that when done well, when fully resourced, these models can be a game changer for our kids. For DLLs and for English learners, we know that growing their bilingualism isn't a nice enrichment or an add-on like it is for kids who speak English at home. These opportunities can actually make or break their access to a quality education altogether. We know that the science is clear that these types of learning programs work and produce better outcomes, but we also know that this is about more than research and child outcomes. This is about their right to a free and appropriate quality education. For too long, language has been used as a tool for exclusion, as an excuse to provide a subpar education, disproportionately affecting Latino children, but dual language learners more broadly, and we know there are many dual language learners with many different languages. We know that continuing to play ping pong on the issue of language of instruction is really malpractice at this point. We know what works, the science is clear, and we're really denying a large and growing subset of the population the right to thrive. So with that in mind, we're here to propose actionable, specific public policy steps to get us closer to making sure that the science and the policy is more aligned. So if we can put the slideshow up now. Great. If you have been following our 4-part webinar series, you know that we're here to lift up our new report and actionable policy agenda outlined in our Start with Equity report. It was generously funded, as Linda mentioned, by the Heising-Simons Foundation. And in the report, we engage deeply with 3 key issue areas that we know disproportionately exclude, harm, and disadvantage kids from historically marginalized communities. Children of color, children with disabilities, children in tribal communities. And many of these, all of these are issues that we know have solutions. The 3 issues that we focused on were discipline, inclusion of kids with disabilities, and dual language learning. Within each of these issue areas, we reviewed the data and the latest evidence. We provide a set of actionable recommendations that will help bridge opportunity and accessibility gaps and get us closer to the education system we all want and know is possible. So with that, let's jump into what we found. We want to start with just a bit of grounding on definitions and terminology. Dual language learners, as we use the term in the report and in this presentation, are usually young children. They're learning their home language while also acquiring a second language. And they're from a home usually where a language other than English is spoken. English learners are typically referred to, they're school-age kids. They're also from a language where, from a home where a language other than English is spoken. But these kids were screened and found to be below proficient in English, so it's really an official classification category for services that makes eligible for services. We know there's a lot of controversy with terms, and I think our preference is to use bilingual children, but policy and then right now uses the term DLL and the term EL. And because this was a policy report and we wanted to be very clear with what policy recommendations we have and where those fit and where those live and who has oversight over those, we use DLLs and ELs respectively throughout our report. So here's what we know and what we found when we reviewed the data and when we reviewed the research base. We know that kids birth through age 8 who are dual language learners are about 11 million kids, or about a third of all kids under 8. We know that English learners, there's about almost 5 million of them, and they're just under 10% of the total K-12 population. And as they progress in age, the numbers get smaller because kids get more likely to get proficient in English as they grow up in grades. We know that there are major data gaps with dual language learners, in particular our youngest kids. And part of this has to do with the major data gaps in general in early care and education settings. But still, we see a lot of gaps with respect to the language background that kids have and the exposure of different languages that they have at home and the bilingualism that they come with. We know that DLLs and ELs are diverse by every measure. We'll go into a bit of that in just a second, but regionally, they live everywhere across the United States. They have a variety of different languages, different languages at home, different income levels, different immigration statuses and generational levels, really diverse. We know that they have cultural, linguistic, and cognitive strengths, including the many cognitive advantages associated with bilingualism that we'll go over a bit today. We know that DLLs and ELs tend to do better in high-quality dual language or bilingual models of instruction compared with English-dominant models. We also know that there's limited data that show that ELs may be underrepresented in these exact models. We know that segregated learning is harmful and it doesn't work, but it's still prevalent. And we know that there are major gaps in assessment, individual child assessment and in global classroom quality assessments that really enable us, or stand in the way of enabling us to understand what quality looks like for DLs. We know that there is a wide array of policy and standards that vary across systems, so childcare, PreK, Head Start, K-12, and across state lines and within state lines. We know that Head Start in particular is a system that has kind of the most comprehensive set of standards for DLLs. We know that no state PreK system or program has a comprehensive set of high quality standards for DLLs, and 18 of them have no policies at all specific to DLLs. And we know that funding for English learners is woefully inadequate. Title III, which is the part of the nation's education law, ESSA, that provides support for English learners, has been stagnant for years and has not even kept up with inflation or the increase in the EL population. So who are DLLs and ELs? Let's jump into this diversity that I mentioned earlier. They live everywhere across the country. They're diverse racially, by immigration generation, by country and language of origin, by income, by parent education. We know that despite this diversity, the majority of DLLs, about 2/3 of them, come from Spanish-speaking homes and identify as Latino or Latina. We know that about 75% of them identify as Latino or Latina. We know that an overwhelming majority of these children are US citizens, even though they may live in mixed status families or they may be children of immigrants, but the vast majority are US citizens. We know they're more likely to live in two-parent households and multi-generation households with grandparents and others. We also know that they're more likely to be low income and have a parent with high school education. So now we want to talk a little bit, we dove into bilingualism in this report, as you'll see, and really tried to understand kind of this bilingual advantage that we hear talked about a lot. So what we found in the research is really that infants are born with the capacity to learn as many unlimited number of languages. There's a common notion that young kids will get confused if you introduce them to a second language and they're still learning their first. But the research really finds that infants are really born with the ability to pick up and understand and learn as many languages as we expose them to. Of course, the quality of that exposure and of that language really matters in terms of how they develop their language and their bilingualism. We know that neuroscientists have observed advantages in bilingual children as early as 7 months, but really across kind of those early years in an array of different outcomes and cognitive outcomes, including problem solving, executive functioning skills, attention shifting, perspective taking, and self-regulation. And if you know a lot about child development, we know that all of these are critical and really make up a big part of how kids learn, which directly affects what kids learn. We know that bilingual exposure, so if you're a really young child and you're exposed to more than one language, these children have greater neural plasticity and gray matter density in the brain. Gray matter contains most of the neurons in the brain and the brain regions involved in some really important cognitive functionings like memory, emotion, speech, decision-making, and lots of others. We know that the science isn't sure or certain like what answers or what kind of makes up or explains these findings that they found in bilingual babies. One hypothesis that's out there and that is articulated in the literature is that this cognitive exercise of having to at all times suppress one language and then execute one language and kind of switching back and forth between those is like brain exercise. And that it kind of works parts of the brain that kind of build up the muscle and the memory for some of these other cognitive skills. So based on all of these great things that are associated with bilingualism, and we know that dual language immersion models or other types of kind of bilingual instructional models where there are two languages of instruction that are kind of split across days or weeks to various percentages, have improved outcomes for dual language learners, but also for kids who speak English at home. One important kind of distinction, there's a whole variety of different types of bilingual learning models. The ones that we're talking about here really have the goal of bilingualism and biliteracy, as opposed to other programs that are more transitional, like bilingual transitional programs, where the goal is to eventually phase kids out of dual language and have them reach whatever level of English proficiency and then kind of phase them out and transition to English-only instruction. So let's take a look at some of the outcomes that are associated with bilingual learning and dual language immersion. We know that kids who are in dual language immersion models actually become proficient in English more quickly. We know that they outperform their peers in math and in reading in elementary school and beyond. We know that they reach national academic performance norms, and we know that they're more likely to become biliterate. There's also a whole number of other benefits that they found in early childhood. So a lot of this research that's on this slide is kind of from K-12. But in the early years, it's been associated with a number of social emotional outcomes, as well as a number of kind of pre-academic skills and learning outcomes. And in adulthood, so at the other end of the spectrum, there have been studies by Patricia Gándara from UCLA and other folks that have really found that kids who are DLLs or who come from a home that speaks a language other than English and who remain kind of bilingual over time. So whose bilingualism is kind of strengthened, they kind of remain balanced bilinguals over time. So they keep their home language as well as acquire English. Compared to dual language learners who kind of lose their home language over time or become less proficient in it and then kind of become English dominant over time. We know that that first group of kids is more likely to go to college or to a four-year institution. They have higher earnings later in life. And we also know that biliteracy is associated with a number of kind of professional advantages in this global economy, more global now than ever, that we live in. Despite all of this, we know that this type of instruction, dual language immersion, is not a reality for most DLs and ELs. Instruction across, particularly early care and education, is primarily in English. Where the home language is used, some research has found it's for behavior support, which does not confer the same types of benefits. Exposure, we also know that exposure to the home language in early childhood education generally decreases over time as kids grow older. So more common in infants and toddlers and then decreases over time. And we know that they're more likely to have a provider who speaks the home language in non-center-based settings. So in family childcare settings or other kind of community-based settings that are not in the center. Although we will point out that just having a bilingual teacher or provider does not equate, it's not the same thing as having dual language instruction in some of these other models. It's a necessary component, but not all of it. So when we look at the different systems and what the standards are across systems, as I mentioned earlier on, Head Start really has kind of the most robust systems standards for DLLs. They're not fully comprehensive and there's still room to grow here, but they are far and away kind of ahead of the rest of the field in terms of standards. We know that 28% of children in Head Start are DLLs and nearly 80% of those speak Spanish. And in terms of the standards that they have, we know that there's explicit language there about valuing the home language. We know that the home language and English are required for DLLs within instruction. For the youngest children, the newest regulations say that you have to use primarily their home language in instruction with English exposure. And for preschoolers, it kind of swaps it. So, English exposure, continued and increased English exposure with also continued exposure to the home language. Bilingual staff who speak children's home language are required if more than half of the kids share the same home language. They conduct assessments in English and the home language, and they have a whole number of culturally responsive family engagement requirements and supports for programs to use. If we look at childcare, it's a lot more variability across the country. We know that data are scarce, as it is for many things in childcare in terms of child outcomes. It's a much more fragmented system and state-led. As of 2017, only about 40% of quality rating and improvement systems in states included any indicator specific to DLLs. And even when DLL indicators were included in quality rating systems, the standard of quality was often quite low, like providing resources to families in their home language. It was quite a low bar. When we look across childcare plans, states develop these childcare plans every year and report them to the federal government every few years. We know that there were some policies listed in those state childcare plans, but again, quite a low bar. And if you look at some of these categories, very few states are doing them. So, for example, state referencing DLLs in their professional development plans. And in most cases, this wasn't that it required providers to have training in dual language learning, but it was an option for providers to take, or it was available to them to take, which is also quite a low bar, particularly considering the large number of DLLs in some states and communities. Move on. So if we look at state PreK systems, we know that less than half of state PreK programs collect data on home language use, including some states that have some really huge DLL populations like Arizona, Florida, New York. Of those that do collect the data, they report that about 29% of the kids enrolled are DLLs. In terms of policy, so I mentioned earlier that 18 states had no policy supporting specifically DLLs in preschool and these public preschool programs. We know that Illinois really explicitly requires bilingual instruction if there's 20 or more DLLs of the same home language enrolled in the same program. Although the mandate, I should note, is for transitional bilingual, as I mentioned earlier, which is distinct from dual language immersion models. And just a few other examples of other policies all of these are reviewed in a NIA report that was released a couple years ago. 7 states have programs that require staff to have training in qualifications for working with DLL, so 7 states out of all the ones in the country. 19 state programs have policies for assessing children in their home language. The rest do not. So now looking a little bit at the K-12 landscape and providing a bit of an overview on kind of the EL, the English learner part of the nation's education law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed 5 years ago now. So here's a number in the report. We go into more depth about some of the changes within ESSA for English learners. A big part or a big kind of takeaway message here is that a lot of the responsibility for English learners switch kind of from the federal level and accountability to really state flexibility. States are now required to develop standards and entry and exit procedures for determining whether a student is an English learner. States may include students formally classified as English learner in the English learner subgroup for academic assessments. Within the law, it includes requirements for family engagement for English learners. In terms of funding, we know that, as I mentioned earlier, Title III is woefully underfunded, and that the effects of that are exacerbated, or perhaps that exacerbates the effects of base education funds being woefully both inadequate and inequitable. So we don't have a ton of time to dig into this. I do encourage you to read the report and to get more information on this piece of it. But we did want to touch on what the reality is and kind of how that's tied to the history in terms of language and segregation and bias. I mentioned earlier kind of that language has been used as a tool for exclusion since the Mexican-American War and there was integration efforts started. We know that early on that there were actually Mexican schools that were established that placed all kids of kind of Hispanic or Latino origin within them. And they explicitly used the language as the tool of exclusion, saying that these kids didn't know English, so they couldn't go to the regular schools, so they created whole Mexican schools and systems of Mexican schools to put these kids into. Oftentimes, these kids only spoke English, and oftentimes, or most of the time, they weren't even assessed for their English assessment. But really, there's a long history with language being used as a tool of exclusion over time. If we look at kind of more contemporary research, there's been some studies. One study in particular used national achievement data and found that the degree of segregation between English learners and their peers was really the greatest predictor of disparities in achievement. We know that today segregation looks a little bit different, right? So we don't have Mexican schools, quote unquote, anymore. But a lot of English learners, particularly in K-12, are segregated at the classroom level. They're pulled out to get English services, or they're immersed, what they call, there's a model called structured English immersion, which was the law of the land in Arizona until just recently, where children, English learners, were pulled out for at least 4 hours a day in kind of self-contained English learner classrooms just to learn English. And so when you think about 4 hours a day, and then you add in lunch, and then you add in recess, and then you add in transitions, that doesn't leave a whole lot of additional time for math and for science and for everything else that a student needs and deserves in order to graduate. And so then it's perhaps not surprising that Arizona has one of the lowest graduation rates for English learners in the country. But it's not just happening in Arizona. There are many other places that have these kind of pull-out models. We also know from research that teachers have lower academic expectations for English learners that grow over time as kids get older. But researchers found that it's not the case in bilingual schools when there's somewhat of an evening kind of the language playing field in terms of what is valued. There's research that finds that, unsurprisingly, bilingual teachers are more effective with dual language learners. We know that there are major issues in assessment bias. Everything we assess, for the most part, there are not very many states that assess kids in the home language and in English. And so really, we get into this more in the report, but really a lot of our assessments are telling us what we already know, what the kid knows in English, as opposed to really understanding kind of the full breadth of what they know across all of their languages. What we also know is a really interesting piece, that it's not just kind of the teacher part, the classroom part, the school part, the state part, but there's been research that's been done in kind of multilingual societies where bilingualism and multiple languages are valued. And the achievement gap between native language speakers of the country and their peers is small or non-existent. So we know that kind of these broader societal biases for monolingual English and this kind of obsession with just focusing on English is really big in the field. The other thing that we will note when it comes to dual language immersion programs, we mentioned this a little bit earlier on, but there's emerging evidence that DLs and ELLs are underrepresented in these models. And this report is an equity report, and that is one of the most profound inequities that we can think of, this kind of double standard, right? So for kids who speak English at home, typically white children, higher resource children, bilingualism is kind of this really wonderful enrichment, like this really great add-on to an education. It's a really prestigious thing. There are language schools kind of cropping up all over the country. But for English learners, when they kind of come to our doors bilingual, instead of kind of building on that strength and that language that they're bringing to the door and seeing it as like this really prestigious thing that we want to build on, like we see for this other group of kids, instead we kind of just focus on teaching them English, and it's all about English, and let's exclude them because they don't speak English yet, and let's segregate them to just focus on the English and actually get rid of the bilingualism, because we don't care about kind of cropping up and developing that growing bilingualism unless you're in this other group of kids over here. So kind of this double standard that's appearing across the country is quite problematic, and kind of without this explicit focus on equitable access to these dual language immersion programs, there's the potential to exacerbate existing inequities that we see already. So with all of that in mind, here is just a subset of the many policy recommendations that you'll find in the report. So I'll go through a few of those that we think will kind of get us closer to aligning the science with policy. So First and foremost, in terms of Congress, funding is always a tremendous issue. So at least doubling funding for kids learning English through Title III and any other relevant funding streams. As I mentioned before, it's been stagnant for a really long time. It has not been updated. The number of kids has grown, so it's woefully inadequate at this point. And doubling it is the kind of very bottom line least we can do. Requesting a government accountability office study on federal funding for dual language learners and English learners. Where is that funding going? What types of models is it supporting? Is it supporting things that are evidence-based or things that are ideologically based? The third is really aligning policy with research, and our main point here that we're trying to drive home in this report based on the data and on the research is prioritizing dual language and strength-based approaches in learning and tying that prioritization to federal funding, alongside phasing out these ineffective English-only approaches that often require or result in segregation. We recommend holding hearings on best practices and really lifting those up and funding models that optimally support ELs and DLs, and using that information to inform investments above and beyond the doubling of Title III you mentioned earlier. And finally, because we know that one of the key requirements to expanding access to dual language immersion models for DLs and ELLs is a workforce and the number of teachers to be able to do that, we recommend funding a national effort to really expand the number of qualified bilingual educators and early childhood providers. In terms of federal agencies, really looking at piloting and investing and really growing our capacity and knowledge on strength-based bilingual education and linguistically diverse workforce preparation programs. Investing, as we mentioned that there are some assessment bias, and there's also a lack of assessment in all of the languages that we need them in. So investing in classroom assessment tools to assess the quality of dual language approaches and child level assessments to better understand kind of the breadth and be able to accurately capture what kids know. And requiring states to report their plans to equitably expand access to dual language programming. In terms of at the state level, you'll see some of these are nested or repeated across, but really discontinuing segregated programs for English learners and English-only programs for English and dual language learners, because it's clear that they're ineffective. Using federal funds to expand bilingual programs and prioritizing DLs and ELs in that expansion. So that's a really important point. We see a lot of cities and communities and states starting to expand access because of demand. Like families love a lot of these bilingual programs. But if there's not a specific kind of equity considered in the policy, so if ELs or DLs are not explicitly prioritized in that policy of expansion, and there's a number of ways to do it that we write out in the report. There's weighted lotteries, there's putting them first in line, there's expanding dual language slots in certain communities. So there's ways to do this. But if we're not cognizant and intentional about equitably expanding access, which means putting DLLs and ELs first in line, then you kind of end up with these systems that, right, we're expanding bilingual learning, but ELs and DLLs get pushed out. We also recommend adopting Head Start DLL standards in state-funded pre-K. We know, as we mentioned earlier, that Head Start, of the existing standards that exist with DLLs, have the most robust standards. And as we learned in the report, one of the common themes is standards are only as good as your monitoring and accountability systems are tied to them. And so really tying and incorporating accountability frameworks and the availability of funds to accurately fund these into those models. And finally, kind of nested across, you'll see, again, improving existing and creating new workforce preparation programs to expand linguistic diversity and knowledge of DLLs. So with that, it is my distinct honor to introduce my mentor, my colleague, and my friend, Yvette Sanchez-Fuentes. Yvette brings extensive experience in providing services to young children from low-income families at the local, regional, and national level. She was most recently the president for the National Alliance for Hispanic Families. Before that, she served as the director of the Office of Head Start nationally, as a presidential political appointee at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And prior to that, Yvette served as the executive director of the National Migrant and Seasonal Head Start Association, where she worked with early education services, policies, and resources for migrant and seasonal farm worker children and families. She's going to lead a really exciting panel of colleagues and experts in dual language learners and English learners. So with that, I'll hand it over to Yvette.
Great. Thanks, Chantel. Well, buenos días for some of you. Buenas tardes a todos los demás. First off, I want to thank Chantel so much for inviting me to facilitate this panel, and it really is going to be a discussion. But I also want to thank everybody behind the scenes who has made all of this work possible, and really for all of the work to bring this all forward and to light. Often I think it feels like we're preaching to the choir. So my hope really is that with this work, we can expand it and really start to talk about very specific recommendations about how we move forward. So first off, I want to share a little bit about my journey, and then I'm going to start by asking each of our esteemed panelists a really specific question so that you can get to know them, and then we'll move into a panel discussion, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And we've actually already been getting questions, so we'll have to really balance out our time so that we can have a full discussion. So this subject is really personal for me because I can remember my parents and my grandparents talking about these Mexican schools and talking about how when you spoke Spanish in school, you'd actually get paddled. So they, would talk about the big paddle that they would use, and you get sent to the principal's office. But in my own really sort of personal life with my son, I will share that he is a trilingual child. And when we actually enrolled him in public school, he's now going to be a senior. On your form, you had to write whether or not you spoke another language in the home. So obviously we did. We said English, Spanish, and he speaks an indigenous language. So not known to us, when he gets to school a week after that, this is kindergarten, he comes home one day and he's super excited, and he's talking about how he is taken out of the class and he's going with this other teacher and 4 other kids, and they're doing these amazing activities, and it's so much fun, and he's loving it. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, like, what's going on here? So when I go to check in, I'm told that when Alejandro was enrolled in the school, he was given this grid where he had to identify what each of the words meant. And on the grid, it's a 12 by 12 grid. There was the word duck. So this little boy, who's 5 years old, is thinking that it's a duck, like quack, quack, como el animal. When in fact, what they wanted him to say was, you have the duck to go under the tree. So because of that, he was put into what we call ESOL. I don't think we use that anymore, but back then we used ESOL. So really for us, it really, from that just became something that was, wow, like we need to figure out what's going on in our public schools and start to become the advocates that we can. What I really loved about this report is the intentionality that Chantel and all of the participants and everyone who got involved, the intentionality around really making sure that we talk about how diverse DLL and EL children and families are, everything from ethnically to culturally to economically. And that these kids and these families and our communities, that we really bring these strengths that should be celebrated. And as Chantel mentioned in her opening, not really used for the purposes of exclusion. And so just to give the panel a little bit of a heads up, I'm hoping that we can have a discussion today around this whole idea of language as a tool for exclusion, especially when we're really in the middle of this pandemic. We're in the middle of these uprisings around racial injustice. And what does it mean when our kids and our families come into our public institutions and are not celebrated for the bilingualism that they bring? So just a little bit about that. And then obviously, I always appreciate hearing about Head Start. And I would just add that when we actually worked on the 2007 Head Start reauthorization, we were really intentional about making sure that there was language in there for supporting and promoting bilingualism as it relates to English language learners. And I think that that work really helped to kick it off. And as Chantel mentioned, really put forward those standards along with the accountability, the professional development, and the training that has hopefully in some communities moved us forward in ways that we're celebrating our kids and our families and our communities, and that we're also respecting our workforce and all of the adult caregivers that care for all of our young children, both from birth all the way into college. So with that, let me kick it off and start with a question for each of our esteemed panelists. And I'm hoping that as you sort of respond to the question, if you can also just tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing, and then get into the question. So I'm going to start with Dr. Jean Garcia, who is a professor at Arizona State University. So, Jean, you've been a school board member, a federal policymaker at the Department of Education, a dean of colleges of education. You are married to a teacher. Your daughter's a teacher. Clearly, have a long history of teaching, both for yourself and your family. Can you, with all of your years and all of your experiences, can you first tell us a little bit about what you're doing? But then also, could you please reflect on how you've seen this issue or this topic or this work change over the years, and is it getting better?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and I'll try to answer that. It's very complex, but you're right. I have some deep roots in education, with both my wife and my daughter engaged presently in one way or another in teaching children, even in this very demanding and very different climate. They are working every day with children, teachers, and others to enhance the educational levels of our young children who come to school not speaking English. Clearly over time, and I'm not a historian, but I've lived through a historical period, we began to shift our understanding based on science. And I think if we want to do anything today is in this pandemic, is that we are many times not paying attention to the science. I think mostly when it comes to language and multilingual development, it's important to pay attention to the science and the development of that science over the last 15 to 20 to 25 years. Keep in mind that in 1993-94, federal policy in the U.S. Department of Education supported something called developmental bilingual programs. This is really what we call dual language programs today. However, the majority of children, as Chantel points out, even today, are not exposed or have the opportunity to participate in programs that essentially utilize their native languages and culture as a resource as they move into English and other academic learning activities. So I hate to say this, but what bothers me most is that we are not following that science very well in the DLL world. Most significantly, I want to be sure that the key policy lever that I think is critical is issues related to human resources of those individuals who are serving this population and these families. We do not have, as Chantel's report, the Equity Project's efforts have very clearly identified, is that we don't have the kind of teachers, the kinds of instructors, the kinds of even other kinds of administrative credentials that are necessary to make sure at the center level or at the program level, at the school level, that we have the individuals who understand the children, who understand the design and implementation of instruction for those children, and how they communicate to the families and the communities in which those children live. Early childhood education has always been not just about children, but about families and about the comprehensive care, social workers, instructors who understand who the population is. So what really we need to do is pay attention to that science. The very best portrayal of that science or summary of that science, not only in this report, but in a Promising Futures report by the National Academies, spends lots of time talking about the workforce and the necessity to have the kind of workforce. Therefore, our federal, our state, and even local programs and centers need to understand, how are we ensuring that we have the right people who design, implement, communicate, and otherwise enhance the learning opportunities and developmental opportunities of children who come to them not speaking English.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to get back to that conversation around the science, because I think it's a really important point. Since in early childhood over the last decade, we've really been focused on the brain research. So it's interesting that we haven't come that far as it relates to DLLs. But let me move now to Dr. Dina Castro. Happy that you're here with us, who is the Velma E. Schmidt Endowed Chair of Early Childhood Education and a professor at the University of North Texas. Dina, you're a nationally renowned researcher in DLL as it relates to early childhood issues. Talk to us about what you've seen, what you think has held us back, and how we can get to where we want to go. And I wonder if you could talk about how this policy agenda fits into that.
Well, good afternoon, Yvette, Jean, colleagues, all colleagues. Is very good to be around friends and colleagues who have been working and, as we say, fighting the fight for quite a while. So thank you for the invitation. Also to Chantel from the Children's Equity Project and to Linda from the Bipartisan Policy Center. Your question is quite large, also very big. Let's see, we've been working on these issues, particularly conducting research that is related to what strategies for classrooms are really something that we identified very early my career in the United States has been the fact that teachers were not really prepared in early childhood classrooms to work with dual language learners. And so that was one of the pieces that I think was central. It has been central to my work over the years. And also, as we continue working in early childhood classrooms from around the country, what was kind of frustrating for us was that we couldn't see the information that came from our research be translated into the policies and into classroom finally, in changes in curriculum, changes in the way practices were being conducted. So that's something that have made me move probably more recently into the policy arena and try to see how I could also contribute with this piece of the research informing policy making, and that's why I'm so excited about this effort, and and the possibility of continuing, generating change to improve the quality of early education for dual language learners. So more recently, as I said, I'm living in Texas now since for the last 6 years, and something that we are working now in partnership with organizations that are working on advocacy in early childhood, as well as generating and proposing policies, is an effort to focus on improving the quality of education of dual language learners in Texas. So here in Texas, we have about 49% of the birth to 8 years of age population are dual language learners. So it's a large population, and the majority of them are coming from, from communities where Spanish is spoken. So there are some issues that I have with using the terminology of home language that maybe we can get into a little later. But just to finish with this piece of what I'm doing now is that this initiative it has the purpose of increase access to dual language immersion education for all children who are classified dual language learners or English learners in the state of Texas. So we are, pushing this piece of policy in the state, and we hope in generating this participation from, at all levels, teachers, childcare providers, policymakers, administrators in schools, and Head Start programs. So it's an initiative focusing on the birth to 8 population in Texas, and we are hopeful to have some good results from this effort. I think I will stop there.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dina. Next, we'll go to Dr. Connor Williams. Hey. Currently, Connor's a fellow at the Century Foundation. And so, Connor, you've written extensively on dual language learners and English language learner issues in a variety of outlets. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this work? And also, if you had to pick one or two of the policies that are in this report to push to the top, which would they be?
Thank you. It's I'm really glad to be here, particularly for that question. I came to this work out of autobiography, like many people. I went to struggling, sometimes even dysfunctional public schools for my own education. I came out of that. Our schools in the district I attended were surrounded by more segregated and better funded and higher quality other schools near us. And I was just always mad about it. It was a class warfare issue for me. I was always angry that we couldn't afford to live in a place where the schools were always excellent, where the experiences every day would have been highly rigorous. And a lot of my K-12 education was just for it to be over. So I came out of that, and I went to college and encountered more people who had private school educations and this extraordinary privilege. And I couldn't put that away. I couldn't stop looking at it. So I started from that position of just outright fury at educational inequity and sort of a grudge that I carried out of my own autobiography. And so then as I've grown into this career, I began as a first grade teacher, and my interest and exposure to the world of dual language learners and English learners really began there. I was a Spanish language learner, but like many people of my demographic, I started taking it in middle school and high school, and I picked it up that way. So the other side of students who were learning English when they came to U.S. schools, that was something new to me as a teacher. And I kept digging and kept digging, and the next thing I knew, I was doing, and it was all I was thinking about. So that's how I've come to it. At the Century Foundation, that's the bulk of my work, is focused on children of immigrants, dual language learners, and older English learning students in U.S. public schools. A couple of things we could do better. I want to echo much of what's been said. I think Gene was right on the nose when he said that one of the big things we need to focus on is the human capital in our public education and early education systems. We have so many multilingual and bilingual adults, many of whom have higher education degrees, who have some credentials, but for one reason or another aren't able to become fully licensed teachers in the front of early education classrooms or elementary or secondary classrooms in the United States. We should be reforming our teacher licensure system to provide alternative pathways for these teachers, so that we can have more bilingual adults in these classes, and so that we can offer more dual language programming for dual language learners. Right now, we have it as a scarce resource, which makes it an equity problem, so that when there aren't enough dual language seats to go around, you can always count on those of privilege being able to leverage inequitable access to that scarce resource. If we had more bilingual teachers, that wouldn't be as big of an issue. I'll also echo what Chantel said earlier, and I think this is actually eminently doable right now, is that we're well overdue for a significant increase in federal funding related to dual language learners and English learners. That should be happening as soon as possible.
Thank you so much. Thanks. That was great. And then I'm happy to meet Dr. Kelly Eddyburn. I want to make sure I said that correctly. I'm so happy to meet you. So Kelly currently is with the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University. And Kelly, you're a measurement expert. So talk to us about some of the measurement issues that are holding back greater equity for our bilingual children. And if you could share with us one example of how these challenges manifest themselves in the determination of services. And then finally, where should the federal government be focusing its energy as it relates to measurement?
Great, thank you. Yeah, again, I'm so happy to be here with all of you, and thank you for the opportunity. I've had experience both as a researcher and as a clinician conducting a lot of different types of assessments, developmental assessments, language assessments, academic, psychoeducational. full psychological evaluations, working with very young children up through young adults in schools and juvenile justice facilities. So I've seen like a range of how our assessments are used, how they determine what access to services children get. And so I think I've seen that the measurement issues, the assessment issues fall into kind of two broad buckets. The first being this issue that we've been talking about with the workforce and training. And so the training is currently inadequate for the folks who are using these assessments, whether that's education, like education professionals such as school psychologists, speech language pathologists, or teachers themselves, or administrators. So the training and education piece, and then the other bucket would be validity issues. So validity related to the assessments that we currently have available. And so I'll speak to the validity issues first. So basically, the tests that we have right now that we use, the assessments that we use, aren't designed by and large with dual language learners in mind. And so often we don't have norms for dual language learners. We don't have evidence that the tests function psychometrically how we think they're supposed to. So we don't actually know that the tests are measuring what we think they're supposed to measure. And so an example about how this relates to services, Lisa PreK and Jeff McSwan and Kelly Rolstad and others have done studies looking at like a language proficiency assessment in English, for example, or in Spanish, and giving those assessments to young dual language learners and seeing that they systematically over-identify those children as having low proficiency in both of the languages to which they've ever been exposed. So these are typically developing children, not children with speech or language impairments, but typically developing children and being identified as having low or no proficiency in the only languages they speak. So that doesn't mean that the children are flawed. That means that the assessments are not measuring what we think they're measuring or what they purport to measure. And so this has tremendous consequences for particularly special education eligibility, because you can imagine that if I get an assessment result back and says that this kid is entirely lacking in language skills, I might actually assume that they do have some kind of language disability, rather than assuming that this measure wasn't intended to be used with dual language learners, or we don't have validity evidence that it's functioning the way it's supposed to function. So I think that has serious consequences, not only for special education eligibility, but our inferences that we make about children, the beliefs that we hold about what they're capable of and what kind of instruction they need and what kind of intervention they might need. So there's this validity issue, and then there's also the issue of training, because if we have teachers and school psychologists and speech language pathologists who haven't gotten enough training in this area of bilingual language development, they are likely to systematically misuse the data they do have access to. So even if we do have these assessments that aren't ideal, that aren't fully up to what we want them to be right now, we do have ways of making culturally, linguistically responsive decisions for kids and strengths-based decisions for children. And if we don't have the right education and training for those folks, then they're not going to be able to make those decisions, and they're going to systematically misuse data in a way that allows us to perpetuate inequities that already exist.
Right.
So
excellent.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, so in terms of, I mean, like the recommendations for the federal government, I think follow those two lines. So, I mean, providing more of an investment in creating and examining assessment tools, and also more workforce development and workforce training programs and funding those, and really making sure that folks know how to conduct culturally and linguistically responsive assessments.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. So we've heard about the brain science. We've heard that dual immersion programs are really the gold standard. We've heard that families, white families in particular, want their kids to be bilingual. So we've got the science, we've got the research, we've got the data. Why are we not listening, or who's not listening? Who should be listening? And I guess I'm wondering, it's definitely a role for the federal government, but is there something that local school districts, schools, early childhood programs can do in order to ensure that kids are getting equitable access? and also that the workforce is being supported. All of you have mentioned the human capital that is critical in making sure that our kids and our families and our communities get the access that they absolutely deserve. So that's to all of you. Anybody can start. Everybody was smiling, so.
I'm happy to start.
Okay. Yeah.
Eugene?
I will go after.
Yeah, let me.
after.
Okay.
Yeah, let me get at your broader question, and that is, why are we not doing something that we know we should be doing? Keep in mind that we didn't do anything for non-English speaking children in the K-12 sector until courts interceded. Unless we would have had Lau in the 70s, unless we would have had Serrano in Texas in the 70s as well. Keep in mind, in resource restricted environments, in which we are in now, I mean, we just don't have a lot of money. Then how can we make people respond to what we know needs to be done? In this case, is something we're trying to follow up. Do these kids have the same civil rights at age 3 and 4 that the K-12 sector has? The courts has determined that in K-12, you must do something to address language diversity and difference. That's not the case at ages 3 and 4, as those kids go into either federally or state-funded preschool environments. They do not have the same protections civilly and court-wise as their brothers and sisters in the K-12 sector. Not that they're doing wonderfully in that K-12 sector, but at least it essentially allows us to have programs and states pay attention to the rights of these children, to what we know is best for them.
Excellent. Dina,
Yeah.
want to jump in?
Yes. I think that Eugene used this keyword rights, right? I agree completely. Some time ago I will share a little anecdote here about that. I was invited to a presentation, and when I finished, towards the end of my presentation, I was just giving my final remarks, and this was an audience of early educators, and I told them that in their hands really was the future of the children, and I was asking them to be advocates for them and for the children, for dual language learners, and their right to be bilingual. So when I was leaving, and the person who had invited me asked me this question, he said, "Dina, may I ask you a personal question?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "When did you become so radical?" So talking about bilingualism and rights for young children was considered radical. I was just really blown my mind, but that was sometimes that's the mentality. So we're not thinking about bilingualism as a right for young children. And I think that's important, and definitely I'm behind all these efforts that will take young children, and especially young children, all bilingual children, but in particular young children, out of this invisibility. And this brings this another point. So my concern, and then when I was thinking about why is that changes are not happening, I think there are reasons that are beyond research. We do, as we see in the report, and we can find the research. The research is there to support that the benefits of bilingualism and development and learning. So why, if we do have the research, changes do not happen at the policy level? Why this, and even sometimes when you have the policies, they are not translated into practices. So we need this vision. So there are structures, there are societal structures that really are more related to discrimination, to racial injustice, that are behind these results, these outcomes that are not, that's why it is so slow. We're so slow in making change happen. That's my perception.
Wow. Thank you. I appreciate both you and Jean calling it out. Kelly.
Yeah, I would jump in and just add to that. I think this report is incredibly timely for that reason, because I think more and more folks are waking up to the idea that these are interconnected systems of oppression. We're not just the problem of man with bigoted beliefs and access to an assault rifle walking into a Walmart last year and terrorizing a Latinx community in El Paso is not distinct from the systematic segregation of dual language learners into English-only classrooms. These are undergirded by the same origin of white supremacy, of racism and xenophobia. And I think there's no, unless there is kind of a social will and a political will, I don't think a top-down policy change is going to happen. I mean, we've had this research for decades that we know what works for supporting these children, and we know how to affirm them and support them and celebrate their strengths. And we're not doing it because there's an ideological foundation of white supremacy that undergirds education, early childhood, pretty much every social structure in this country. And so we need to dismantle that simultaneously, I think.
Yeah. Let me also mention this when I talked about why I do this work. I have 3 multilingual learner children in my house because their mother is Welsh, of all things. And so they're growing up Welsh-English bilingual. And then they also, the 2 older ones, attend a Title I bilingual school here in Washington, D.C. But I want to focus on, I think, what is the softer and more insidious version of white supremacy that's in this, not the sort of big flagrant violations of people's dignity in mass shootings. I want to talk about the systemic stuff, which is hard to see because so many of us are complicit in it. Things like this, that the overwhelming majority of US teachers are white and are monolingual. Diverse teacher candidates are kept out of the US teaching force through a variety of systems or pieces of our licensure systems. And so then what that means then is that it's just hard to offer more dual language immersion. I have yet to run into school district leaders who, when faced with parental demand from this, don't want to expand access to bilingual education or dual language immersion. They always find parental demand and they're always interested in it, but they almost never can find enough teachers to do it rapidly. And so then again, this is what I said before, when you have this resource and it's scarce because of these systemic biases, the people who are always going to get more access are the people with power. In my demographic, in my cohort of urban, coastal, city-dwelling, highly educated, white, middle, and upper middle class people, it is taken as an obvious thing that access to dual language immersion is something that they are fighting for their kids. I could tell you endless stories of people who have moved heaven and earth, who've mortgaged their house and leveraged themselves to the gills to buy just over the line in the neighborhood where there's the dual immersion program. The trend line in DC, just as it is in most places where dual language immersion exists, is that these programs are steadily being moved from 2-way dual immersion, where they are roughly integrated by language, enrolling roughly equal proportions of native speakers of each language, to 1-way immersion programs where they serve more white, more wealthy, more English-dominant children, and very few native speakers of the target language. I could tell you stories of a major U.S. city I visited some years ago for research. One of the board members told me, he was the only school board member who was a person of color. He had just lost his re-election bid because the teachers union went after him. He was the only person of color. He was a Latinx fella, and he had been pushing so hard for the expansion of dual language immersion programs that a number of white monolingual English teachers had lost their jobs. Every time a new DLI program opened, then they had to overhaul the staff. So the teachers union went after him and installed a new candidate instead, a white monolingual English-speaking teacher to put an end to that. There's just so many ways in which our entire education system is set up to deliver this kind of instruction to those who want it and can afford it and can actually put their muscle and their privilege and their wealth behind it. That's why it's not happening. It's rank human selfishness.
Okay. Thank you, Connor. So, thank you all of you for just your very honest and genuine response to that question. I know sometimes it can be difficult, but let me just throw a question out because Connor, I think, and also Jean, everyone has mentioned human capital at some point, and we have a question from Karen, which is a human capital question, but related to policy around, do you all think that it's a good idea or a possibility of implementing a policy at the federal level that would hold higher education accountable for creating teacher preparation programs that both train them in early childhood education along with bilingualism? Everybody's nodding.
Can I speak to that as a previous dean who might be held accountable in that way? I really think it's worth pursuing. The federal government does have requirements for receiving federal dollars and ensuring that those dollars are invested appropriately to meet certain goals. I don't see a problem indicating to colleges of education, to those individuals who are preparing instructors and administrators and other early childhood personnel, to essentially say, we will provide resources if you will essentially move forward in that. Keep in mind, the federal government usually ties this to resources. So I can imagine that, again, historically, there were grants from the Department of Education to colleges of education to produce more bilingual teachers. And essentially, they were held accountable receiving those dollars. I don't see why we shouldn't that kind of a policy nationally. And that would require use of dollars that go to these institutions to achieve certain goals. One of those goals essentially being produce more human capital appropriately defined for this population.
I will just follow up on that comment in terms of, I think for a while I've been talking about this and the idea that every teacher in the United States should be prepared to work effectively with bilingual children. Every teacher, not just those that are pursuing that are going to get a certification on bilingual education. Bilingual children, and you want to call them dual language learners or English learners, following the science. These kids are bilingual if they are able to understand content and produce language in 2 languages, no matter what level of skill they have. And just keep that little piece of science here. Okay, so for bilingual children, and really, these kids are in every classroom. How likely it is that a teacher in the United States is going to go to a school or a classroom in which there are no bilingual children? I mean, that's so really what it makes sense is that general education or teacher preparation, general education should incorporate, coursework that prepare teachers to work with bilingual children. As an example, just very quickly, give that we conducted a study here in Texas with my students, and actually evaluating analyzing the content of degree plans for teacher preparation programs in 29 of the highest ranked universities in Texas in education. And what we found was that the general education certification programs only had 9% of their coursework dedicated to linguistic and cultural diversity, versus about 28%, if I remember correctly, on the ESL certification and 34% in the bilingual certification. So that's the percentage. So even the bilinguals, 34% for teachers of the content, for teachers who are being prepared to be bilingual. I think we have this is an example in Texas, which is a state that has education. Has been having bilingual education program for a long time. So imagine what's happening in the rest of the country.
Yeah, exactly. Callie or Connor, do you want to jump in on this policy question?
Yeah, I'd just add one small thing. I think I'd mostly agree with Jean. There's no reason the feds couldn't put together competitive grants to expand bilingual training programs. The other thing is that it would be well within the federal government's purview to require states, in exchange for all of the federal education funding they get, you could run this through Title II or even through Title I or Title III, I think, to provide explanations for discrepancies in their teacher candidates and teaching force demographics. To say, look, we noticed that your state has these percentages, racially, ethnically, et cetera, except your teaching force looks this other way. You're going to need to provide us at least some analysis of why you're seeing this very white teaching force in a state that isn't very white. And that it wouldn't require the states to change necessarily, but it would instantly put them on the back foot.
Go ahead, Callie.
Oh, I would just add also just one quick thing that as someone who is trained as a school psychologist, I think there's also a need for accrediting bodies, because I don't think I don't know that the federal government can hold these higher education programs to account, but accrediting agencies for school psychologists, for speech language pathologists who accredit these programs that are training future school psychologists and speech language pathologists and these other folks who really make important decisions about kids' special education eligibility and other types of instruction and intervention that they get. I think these folks also need to be held accountable for creating training programs that better address the needs of DLLs, because they, like Dina pointed out, they are also going to encounter DLLs at every school, at every level. So, yeah.
Exactly. Well, thank you.
Let me
Thank you all
say-
for that. Yeah.
Let me just say that we don't need to wait for the federal government or the state government. Higher education institutions can do this. At both Berkeley and Arizona State University, all early childhood educators were required to essentially be prepared to serve dual language learners, early childhood educators. And it was either in Spanish or in Navajo, given the two largest languages in the state. That was a decision at the college level, at the faculty level. Wait for the state or the federal government to ask us to do that.
So
And if
that
I
brings
may,
up
I
a
just
great-
add, yes, sir. No, that's fine. That's fine.
Go ahead, Dina.
No,
Okay,
I just
well,
wanted to add also that I just wanted to mention also that in my department at the College of Education at UNT, we are now in the process of changing the certification, the teacher certification, so that we will only prepare early childhood to sixth grade teachers with an ESL content. So we're not going to prepare general education teachers anymore. So every teacher in our program, teacher preparation program, will have an ESL component.
That's really good to hear. And for me, that brings up this idea of the going back to human capital and people make it happen. Alan sent sort of a similar question that I also had, but is it the people, the reason, you know, Jean, you're in Arizona, Dina, you're in Texas, you know, I don't know if in states, some of the states that Chantal has pointed out in the report where they have more regulations around how to ensure equitable access to bilingual kids and families. Is it the people? Is it because the governor or the superintendent or the local principal all happen to be bilingual and understand this story? Going into a little bit of also like that change in the mindset. I don't know. Why is it happening in some places and not others?
Well, that doesn't mean that it's easy. So even if you have the commitment at the local level or in the higher education, you know, world, let's say, you know, universities and community colleges, that doesn't mean that, you know, changing policies and creating more equitable education is easy. So you have to be creating this critical mass in the community in just as partnerships, right? And so that I think that's important. Giving voices to the families is kind of an effort that everybody who is directly involved should be advocating. So I think that there's a lot of work that is sometimes beyond just the school.
Yeah,
it needs to work with the community. Yeah.
I would only add that.
Yeah.
So I'd say something that I hate to say, which is that where I've seen it, equity reforms related to DLLs and ELs go best are the places that have gone slowly. And I hate to say that because I'm an impatient man. I have no interest in waiting to deal with questions of equity. But for instance, it's very fashionable right now especially at the local level, to announce large expansions of dual language immersion, even at the state level in a few places. That's easy-ish to do, but it's hard to do that with a good equity foundation to make sure that there are seats reserved for English learning students or for DLLs. The states that have gone slowly to make sure that when they push these kinds of things, they've really gotten all the buy-in and they have everybody on board and they've built a firm foundation. Those are the places that have had the real success. If you just launch a bunch of new dual immersion programs, it doesn't take long before people with means take them over.
Yeah, that's true.
Great.
So we've been talking a lot about data and research and policy, and Chantel shared a little bit about her story. I shared a little bit about mine, and I would just ask you all, as we're sort of coming a little bit to the end, but not quite, to share a story or an experience that you've had in your work that keeps you up at night, good or bad, that is related to all of this work that we all have done collectively together and will continue to do. And anyone can start.
I'll just very briefly say that I'm haunted by, there's a local public education advocate that I had a conversation with once personally. He didn't know who I was. I just happened to run into him socially once. He's a huge public education advocate, and he explained to me, though, that he had chosen a non-public school for his young children because it was important for him to make sure that they grew up to be bilingual. And it was so critical, he knew, because they had gone to a bilingual daycare, one that he had paid a lot for, and it was just super important for him. And that's why it was okay that he was acting that way, that he was spending, literally his career was one, advocacy for public ed and a lot of scorning people in private education and the like. But his actions were another. And I don't know how to deal with that kind of hypocrisy insofar as that it's his personal behavior and his political actions are so different. I think that's what a lot of people in US cities and in US states thinking about equity and language right now do. I think that's where we are now, is that we haven't really unearthed a lot of the selfishness and a lot of the biases that are driving how people actually act. And so we a lot of us say the right things, but we don't actually do them.
Yeah, good point.
I'd like to put a plug in for communication with families of our dual language communities.
Yeah.
I grew up in a migrant, not immigrant, but migrant farm worker family, and my parents understood that education was important, but didn't understand how to implement that belief into their 10 children, and so early childhood education is a bridge to our families in ways that enhance their understanding of development and learning, and broadly their participation in it as a partner. And so what really bothers me is that our early childhood educators are not taking advantage of the resources that exist in families and communities of dual language learners.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Yeah.
I think
Dina?
on top. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Kelly.
Go ahead,
I was
Kelly.
just going to share something that built on that. I think something that sticks with me is the countless families that I've worked with who in schools and in juvenile justice facilities and early childhood that have shared with me that they've been told by teachers or other school professionals or even principals to not speak to their child in their primary language, in the language that the family speaks at home. And I think that every single time it's haunting to think about what that means and what that parent walks away from that exchange with on a human level. And it also just keeps reinforcing this idea of this dominant English monolingual ideology that we have that's so stubborn here in the US. But also how the lack of training for educators and school psychologists and principals about language development actually proliferates this harmful message and myth to parents, and one that actually harms the process of language development itself, that we know that speaking to your child in any language is so helpful and supportive and nurturing of development and needed for a kid to develop language skills. And then on top of that, how much it impacts a child's identity development and social emotional development and their family relationships. And how I've seen the use of a parent and a family's language with a child and in therapy be so healing and so affirming and so supportive of a child's development in a way that it just shows me that like language itself can just unlock well-being. And I think that we need to be really critically conscious of that when we're in schools and what messages we're sending to parents about the languages they use and what languages we uplift and which ones we ignore or segregate or tell people not to speak, because we understand the world through language. And so I think it's so critically important to be affirming in that way, especially because of how prevalent that myth is.
Absolutely. So making sure that we're talking with our families. Dina?
Yes, I think that just as we'll follow up what Kelly had mentioned, the social emotional development of children and how the support or lack of support to their two languages can create, an impact, a negative impact in their social emotional development and social identity. I just want to share something that happened recently here in Texas. I was at the grocery store and then at the cashier, and I saw the cashier had a label. It has Mario was his name. And when I find someone that may be a Spanish speaker, I like to speak Spanish to that person. Of course, before I ask, do you speak Spanish in English? And he was being very smiley, and then turned when I said ask if he spoke Spanish, he turns to me in a very, I would say, decomposed. He was not well, and he said, no, I don't speak Spanish. And I even don't continue and say, well, maybe we're not doing well enough in Texas that not everyone has access to bilingual education. And he turns to me and said, I know Japanese, and I don't want anything to do with Spanish. I don't need it. And to me, that comment was so painful that really, I can even get a little emotional when I talked about it, because I felt the pain in that comment. And I was thinking immediately how much this child, as a child, this individual, this young man has suffered, because he is Latino, because he speaks Spanish. So this brings for me the issue of racial discrimination, that usually we do not talk about racial discrimination for Latinos, and we Latinos do not cite this fact that we are not being supported as bilingual individuals and bicultural individuals, consider the human beings as a whole. So we have to hide part of who we are when we are outside of the home. And I want to leave you with this thought. Are we going to continue using the term home language? I think that's a message that we're giving a message, definitely. That language belongs to your home, not to the school. Belongs to your home, closed doors inside your home, not to your community. So we are part of this community. We all are contributing. And why do we have to hide?
Exactly.
And I think this is the message that children are getting every time they go to school, and sometimes, and when they make an intentional decision not to speak Spanish anymore. Yeah. And I think that it's not only about bilingualism as a phenomenon in general, but certain languages. And so we need to be also being very open and explicit when we talk about this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So we've only got about 2 minutes left. So I'm going to end with one final thing. It's a very specific question to all of you. It's been a really particularly challenging time for Latinos across this country over the last couple of years. On top of that, we've got all of the protests that are happening with racial injustices. We talked about systems, right? At the very heart of it, it's the systems that have been created in this country over the years. I myself have, as I mentioned earlier, a Latinx teenager advocate in my house. And I just wonder for you all, does all this next generation who are getting really loud and getting out there and being very powerful and insistent on what needs to change, does that give you hope? And what kind of change would you like to see? And I would ask you all to keep it to like 30 seconds if you can. And even less. Jean, we'll start with you.
Sure, I say it's very affirmative. There is more hope. My grandson was out there in the streets, a 16-year-old. Even I didn't do that when I was 16 years old. So yes, there's definitely a different time and there's more hope.
Absolutely. Connor?
Absolutely. I find the energy inspiring, and it's been fun and sobering to try to describe it to my kids who aren't quite old enough for the streets yet. I have a 9-year-old who's very aware of these protests and very curious. And I'm so glad, and it's also so painful.
Yeah. Kelly?
Yes, I'm so hopeful, and I'm so excited that people are waking up to the intersectionality of these issues and trying to actually address them with like a multi-pronged approach, which I'm glad that this report actually addresses as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Dina?
Well, I also am very hopeful in what I would like to see happening, and I think the conditions are giving now, is that this movement is again bringing eliminating the invisibility of Latinos. I want to see more Latinos out on the streets also protesting. So that's my thought, my hope.
Awesome. So with that, I'm just going to say thank you to all of you for the conversation today. I'm going to turn it over back to Chantal. But with that, as always, in the words of Cesar Chavez, ¿verdad? Sí se puede. So thank you all. And thanks, Chantal.
Thank you, Yvette. So just to wrap up, last week we had a discussion on the inclusion of kids with disabilities. That's what the webinar was. We dug into that part of the report, and we kind of ended in a bit of frustration on the fact that there we also have the science, there we also have the law, but we haven't yet had the public will to make some real fundamental changes to promote inclusion. And we ended with this like profound frustration of how your freedom, your rights all depend on public will. And here again, I think it boils down to public will. And with historically marginalized groups, our rights always boil down to public will. But I think like we ended today, we're in an unprecedented moment in history where real systemic reform to dismantle systemic racism, of which all of this is a part, is on the table. And let's not get it twisted, right? Like language is a tool of exclusion that is motivated by racism. Racist people and racist policies alike use language to target. Yvette mentioned that kids were corporally punished for speaking Spanish at school. My mom and her 7 brothers and sisters were some of those kids. So they had to police their language, and they spoke only Spanish at home with my immigrant grandparents and only English at school. And if they slipped up, they knew what came. That's why it's prestigious for white children, and it's to really, be bilingual and have all these kind of enrichments on top. And it's really a top priority to remove it from our kids who bring bilingualism to them, from their home. It's the reason why our laws, our education laws, our standards, our assessments, our instruction are all centered on English, right? It's a perpetuation of this white supremacy. We pick language as the tool for exclusion for these particular kids, and then we built entire systems up around it. And like Dina mentioned, right, like this is not a new fight. People on our panel and countless others have been fighting this fight for a long time. In fact, before Brown v. Board of Education, Mexican families fought segregation via Mexican schools. In fact, the first case in US history to rule on desegregation was against the segregation of Mexican Americans in the Mendez v. Westminster case. So this is not a new fight. The science is not new either, as we've heard. So let's really take this opportunity after the pandemic, after kind of everything that this country's been through, to do better and to pivot toward equity and science. Let's look at our budgets from Congress all the way down to the childcare program on the corner and look at how we allocate our resources and invest in dual language immersion and use it as a strength to build on. Let's get higher ed together, as Jean talked about, to actually prepare the workforce for the kids they're going to work for. I'll repeat it one more time. 1 in 3 kids are DLLs, and they live everywhere, not just in South Texas or New York City. Let's get state licensing and private licensing systems like the CDA on board with this. Let's look at all of our systems. And if we're measuring, for example, classroom quality with the class tool, let's make sure that it gives us information on how it's doing for dual language learners. Let's make sure our quality rating systems include DLLs at every level, right? It's not the pinnacle of quality to suddenly include one thing about a DLL, right? It should be at level 1. It's a basic fundamental right piece. Let's get our act together on standards, on monitoring, on accountability. We list all of these things out in the report. DLI should no longer be one of many options. It should be the option. And if we want to succeed, as everyone's mentioned here, let's fund it right. So thank you again to Yvette and to Linda and BPC and to our panel. I want to give an especially big shout out to Kelly for all of her work on the report, and Connor and Jean as well, and to Dina for being a great thought partner. This wraps up our 4-part series. Please go read the report. You can find it on the link there, and have a great rest of your day. That's it.